The winter my mother died, she left me three things in a plain cedar box: her voice recorder, her fence tools, and a note with one instruction: keep feed in the cedar trough by the south fence gap at dusk. Same place, same hour, same whistle. For 7 winters she had done that without fail, and whatever came to take that feed never forgot her voice. What followed after I took her place on that fence line changed how I understood solitude on that ranch. I came back to Goat Rocks in late September, 3 days after we buried her in Packwood. The road up to the boundary place had not changed since I left at 19, but the turns felt narrower, and the fir shadows came down earlier than I remembered. The sign at the cattle guard still leaned the same way, with Ford Boundary Ranch painted in block letters she had refreshed every spring. Her truck sat by the barn with a dead battery and a rake in the bed. Dust had gathered on the windshield in a fine, even coat, like she had parked it on an ordinary afternoon and planned to come back before dark. Scout met me at the porch steps. He was an old blue heeler by then, muzzle grey, one ear bent at the tip from a long-ago kick by a half-wild steer. He did not bark when I got out of my truck. He walked straight to me, pressed against my leg, and stood there with his weight leaning in. I put my hand on his neck and felt every ridge of his spine through the coat. Inside, the house held her habits in place. Her cast-iron pan sat upside down on the stove lid. A clean dish towel hung on the oven handle, folded twice, corners aligned. Her boots stood by the back door, with mud dried in a thin fan across the toes. Nothing looked staged or sentimental. It looked interrupted. I set my duffel in my old room, though there had not been a child living there in 14 years. Then I took the cedar box from the kitchen table and carried it to the metal table by the window. Rain started in a fine, straight sheet against the glass. Scout curled by the wood stove and slept with one eye open. The recorder was the old kind, hand-sized, with worn rubber buttons and a cracked battery cover held shut by black tape. She had labelled each cassette with painter tape and a date. The last one was marked late August. I sat with my elbows on the table and pressed play. Her voice came out rougher than I remembered. She had always sounded clear on the phone, direct and brisk. But here I heard breath between lines and a dry catch in her throat she never admitted to anybody. She did not waste words. Kane. If you are hearing this, then I did not make it through September. There is feed in the south bin. Fill the cedar trough at dusk. Same amount each day, same whistle. Do not stand in the gap. Do not cross the wire at dusk. If weather turns hard, still go. If I did one thing right these last 7 winters, it was consistency. She paused long enough that I thought the tape had ended. Then she spoke again. It is not cattle feed. You know the mix from the red notebook. Pear when you have it. Boiled egg when you do not. Salt in cold months. No fear in your body when you go out there. Animals read that. So does this one. The tape hissed for a second. A chair moved on her end, wood against wood. I never named it because names make people claim things. This is not ours. It stays outside the fence for a reason. Keep the line, keep the hour, whistle once, then leave. I sat there with my thumb resting on stop and did not move. The rain grew heavier. Water ran down the window in long lines that caught the yard light and turned white for a second before going dark again. Scout lifted his head, looked toward the south side of the house, then settled his chin back to the floor. I played the tape again, then a third time, and wrote her instructions in a pocket notebook in block letters like I was copying field measurements. I had no argument with what she asked. My mother had run that place alone for 20 years, through drought, early snow, and one wildfire season that singed the whole eastern ridge. She did not ask for ritual. She asked for work done right, the same way every day. By the first week of October, my mornings had found their old shape. I checked the north fence first because elk leaned there at dawn. I salted the mineral box by the west pasture and broke ice in the trough if the night dropped below freezing. I cut alder for kindling and split fir rounds after lunch. I patched one loose board in the hay shed and set new staples on 3 sagging wire runs by the county line. At noon I ate at the metal table, usually eggs and bread or reheated beans, and reached for a second cup before I remembered there was no one across from me. Grief did not come to me as tears then. It came as unfinished motion. One plate set out and put back, 2 forks in my hand before I noticed. A sentence formed out loud and nowhere to send it. At 4 each afternoon I started the feed. The red notebook sat on the counter beside the sink, open to a page with her tight handwriting. Winter mix, chopped pears, cracked grain, a spoon of rendered fat, half a boiled egg, pinch of salt when frost starts. I did it exactly. I carried the pail to the south fence at dusk with Scout at my heel and laid the mix in the cedar trough just inside the wire, near the old gap where one lower strand had been replaced with a short, removable pin. The first evening I did not whistle right away. I stood with my gloves in my hand and watched the timber beyond the fence, trying to see what she had seen. The tree line there held cedar and second-growth fir, with sword fern packed thick along the ground and blackberries running wild in the lower drawer. Nothing moved except rain shaking from branches. I put 2 fingers in my mouth and gave one low whistle, short and even. It carried through the wet air and came back faint off the slope. Scout stayed quiet. His ears were forward, but his tail was neutral, not tucked, not stiff. I stepped back from the gap and walked to the porch without turning around. The trough was empty at dawn. No tracks I could trust because rain had gone all night and washed the soil smooth. No scattered feed, no sign of birds pecking. Just clean boards and the faint, sweet smell of pear gone sour in the corners. The second day was clear and colder. Frost held in the low grass by sunrise and melted by 10. I spent the morning replacing one split post near the south run and found older tool marks in the wire where my mother had twisted and retwisted repairs by hand. Her pliers left a distinct flat bite in the metal, and seeing it did more to steady me than anything people said at the funeral. At dusk I carried the pail again. Same place, same amount, same whistle. Scout walked ahead this time and stopped 10 feet from the gap, body angled toward the timber. A low sound came from his chest, not a growl, more like a warning he kept to himself. I laid my hand on his shoulder and felt his muscles settle under my palm. "It is all right," I said softly, mostly for him, maybe for me. "We are keeping her pattern." He glanced at me once, then looked back at the trees. 3 days passed in that rhythm. Feed at dusk, trough empty by morning. On the 4th day I found one thing different. A smooth grey stone, oval and palm-sized, sat on the top rail 2 feet from the gap. It did not belong there. The nearest creek stone with that polish was half a mile down slope, and no jay had carried it to wire height, for no reason I knew. I picked it up, weighed it in my hand, and set it back where I found it. That evening I put the feed down and whistled once. The sky had gone hard clear, and the first stars showed above the ridge. I stayed long enough to hear the creak and the faint click of cooling metal from the fence brace. Then I turned and walked to the house, boots loud on frozen mud. I did not tell anyone in town what I was doing. There was no need. Folks there had known my mother as a person who fixed her own gate, paid cash at the feed store, and did not ask for help unless a bull got out. They respected that. They also talked too much over coffee when a story gave them room. I kept this one between the house, the dog, and the south line. By mid-October, the weather shifted in small, stubborn ways that felt like a hand pressing on the day. Wind dropped before dusk and left the woods too still. Chickadees quit the lower shrubs earlier than usual. Scout started taking his evening position by the south window an hour before feed time, head up, listening. One evening, as I crossed the yard with the pail, he stopped so abruptly that grain sloshed against the bucket side. His nose pointed to the far cedar trunks, and his ears pinned forward. I followed his line and saw only deepening shadow between trees. Then, from somewhere beyond the fence, I heard one branch bend and release, under weight too heavy for deer and too deliberate for wind. I set the feed in the trough and gave the same low whistle my mother had taught me when I was 10 and learning to bring in strays from the west meadow. The sound left me and settled into the timber. Nothing answered in any way I could name. Still, as I stepped back and closed the pin in the lower wire, the hair rose along my forearms under my jacket sleeves, not from fear alone, but from the sense that I had been witnessed and measured and allowed to leave. I slept lightly that night. Rain came near dawn and tapped the roof in a steady pattern I remembered from childhood. When daylight spread across the kitchen floor, I pulled on boots and walked to the south fence with Scout beside me. The trough was clean again. On the top rail, centered over the gap, lay 2 short sticks crossed in exact symmetry, one over the other, both stripped of bark and cut clean at the ends as if placed by careful hands. I did not touch them for a long time. Scout stood close at my knee and did not make a sound. I kept my hands at my sides and watched the crossed sticks until my fingers stopped wanting to reach for them. They were both alder, both shaved clean, both cut to near the same length. Not stormfall, not dropped at random. Placed. I finally stepped back and said, quiet enough that my breath made more sound than words, "We leave that there." Scout looked up once, then back to the rail, and we walked to the house without touching the fence. Inside, I set water to boil and fed the stove. The kitchen windows faced east and south, and by habit I worked where I could see the line. Steam rose off my sleeves. The house took on that mix of coffee, wet wool, and wood smoke that had been the smell of every October I could remember. I put one mug on the table, then opened the cupboard and took down a second before catching myself. I stood with both in my hands for a long second, then put one back and shut the door with my hip. That morning, I sharpened the draw knife in the shed and peeled bark from split rails for the lower west run. I checked the mineral blocks in the north pasture and noted one corner gnawed down by elk. I measured feed from the south bin into a clean pail, wrote the amount in my pocket notebook, and closed the lid tight against raccoons. I kept busy in straight lines. Work done in order left less room for empty thought. By the second week of October, my days settled into the same pattern down to the minute. Up before light. Stove first. Scout fed while coffee heated. Fence walk with pliers and staples in my coat pocket. Mid-morning repair work, then water haul from the tank if the creek line was low. Lunch at the metal table by the window. Afternoon split wood stacked by species. Alder for quick heat, fir for overnight burn. Feed mixed at 4. South fence at dusk. The crossed sticks stayed on the rail through 3 days of wind and 1 long rain. I watched for crows to knock them down, or for weather to shift them out of line. They did not move. On the 4th morning, they were gone. No fragments below. No chew marks, just bare rail and a faint, dry imprint where each had rested. I did not chase meaning. I wrote in the notebook, crossed sticks removed overnight. Then I went to the barn and changed a cracked belt on the old generator. 3 days later, I drove into town for salt blocks, kerosene, and dog food. Packwood was 15 minutes in good weather and 25 when fog sat low over the river. I parked at Larkin Feed between a red stock trailer and a county truck with a dented fender. Inside, the place smelled of seed grain and oil soap. The woman at the counter knew me since grade school and did not ask for details beyond what people ask when they are being kind. "You settling in all right?" she said while she rang the bags. "I am keeping up with it," I said. She nodded, slid the receipt across and touched my hand once before turning to the next customer. That was enough. On the way back, I stopped by the cemetery road but did not turn in. I sat at the shoulder with the engine idling and looked at the rain darkening the grass by the gate. I had spoken at her service in 2 plain sentences, and I had meant them. She taught me useful work. She kept her word. In the truck, with no one watching, I said one more thing out loud that I hadn't said there. "You were not supposed to go first." Then I put the truck in gear and went home before dusk. That evening at the fence, Scout stood behind my left leg with his chest touching my calf. I poured the mix into the cedar trough. Pear, grain, salt, half egg, same as written. I gave the low whistle and stepped back. The woods took the sound and held it. I kept my eyes on the gap until dark made trunks and shadow blend into one wall. Nights got colder. Frost crept farther up the pasture each dawn. I moved kindling inside the mudroom so I would not walk to the shed in sleet. I covered the pump head with burlap and checked the stock tank twice daily for thin ice. Scout took to sleeping across the back door, nose pointed south. Around midnight, he would wake, lift his head, and listen toward the fence line without growling. After a minute, he would set his chin down again and sleep. On a clear Thursday, I found tracks outside the south wire before sunrise. 3 strides, heel-to-toe spacing too long for any man I knew, each print deep enough to press through frost crust into dark soil below. No tread pattern, no sharp boot edge. The forepart of each print was broad and rounded, as if weight had spread through a flexible foot. I crouched with the tape from my tool belt and measured the nearest one at just over 16 inches. I marked the size in the notebook and sketched the shape on the facing page. Then I covered the prints with an upside-down trough pan weighted by 2 stones, so wind would not disturb them before full light. After breakfast, I took my mother's old camera from the drawer by the sink, loaded film from a sealed box, and went back to the fence. I photographed each print with a ruler beside it. I took 1 shot wide to show distance from the wire, 1 from knee height, 1 from directly above. When I finished, Scout stepped forward, sniffed the nearest edge once and backed up on his own. "Good boy," I said. "Leave it." He obeyed without looking at me. I called the district wildlife office from the wall phone by the pantry and reported unusual tracks at my south boundary. The ranger who answered sounded tired, then polite. He asked if I had cattle losses, bear sign, or evidence of poachers. I told him no to all 3. He said someone could swing by when they were already in the area, maybe next week, maybe later, if weather held. I wrote his name and the time in the notebook and thanked him. No one came that week. 3 days passed and rain softened the track edges into shallow basins, then erased them. The rhythm held. Dusk feed, 1 whistle, step back, walk away. The trough emptied each night. On the 9th evening after the tracks, I added 2 winter apples to the mix, because the pear crate had gone soft at the bottom. At dawn, the trough was clean again, but 1 apple stem lay on the rail, set parallel to the wire pin. It was fresh and unchewed, placed with the same care as the earlier sticks. I set it on the windowsill above the sink and let it dry there. Weather turned in earnest by late month. Clouds sat low over goat rocks for days, and rain came in slant lines that rattled the tin edge of the barn roof. The ground at the south line went from firm to sponge. Alder leaves pasted to my boots in red-brown layers. Scout began refusing the East Trail after sundown, though he had run that route for years. He would walk to the turn, stop, look once into the trees, and come back to my side without command. One afternoon, while I was resetting staples on a sagging span by the gap, I heard a knock from beyond the fence. Wood on wood, single strike. Then silence. I waited, pliers still raised. A minute later it came again, farther upslope. Not axe work, not branch fall. Deliberate spacing, like a signal sent and answered at distance. I finished the staple, coiled the wire and stood listening until my hands got cold enough to ache. Nothing followed. At dusk I mixed feed with boiled eggs and a heavier spoon of fat for cold nights. I carried it out under a sky the colour of old lead. Scout walked ahead, then slowed and moved behind me, shoulder brushing my knee. I knelt, set the pail down, and heard movement to my right in the cedar trunks. Not a rush. One step, then another, weighted and careful. I did not turn quickly. I kept my body square to the trough and poured the feed in one smooth motion. Grain tapped wood. Eggshells clicked against the board. I gave the whistle and stepped back 3 paces as my mother had instructed. From the timber came a low breath sound deep in the chest, followed by the soft scrape of bark under weight. I could not see a body. I could feel presence the way you feel heat from a stove before you touch the iron. Scout stayed still. His ears were forward, tail down but loose. No growl in him. I held where I was for a slow count of 10, then turned and walked toward the porch without looking back. Halfway to the house, I heard one branch bend and release behind me, then another. Not closing distance, moving along the fence, matching my pace from the other side until I reached the yard light. When I stepped onto the porch boards, the sound stopped. I waited there in the yellow spill from the bulb, hat in my hand, rain ticking on the metal roof overhang. The south line lay mostly dark, beyond the reach of the light. Scout sat beside my boot and looked toward the gap, as if he were waiting for one more thing to happen. Nothing else did. We went inside and I latched the door and I wrote every detail down before the stove burned low. I closed the notebook, set the pencil across the spine, and listened to the stove settle into a lower burn. Scout had taken his place by the back door, chin on his paws, one eye open toward the south wall. Rain still tapped the roof, lighter now, each drop spaced farther apart. I poured the last of the coffee into the sink, checked the door latch once with my hand, and turned down the lamp. I slept in shallow pieces. Near midnight, I woke to Scout standing over me. Not whining, not scratching, just standing with his weight angled toward the hallway. I sat up and heard it too. A single knock from outside. Wood on wood, dull and clean, somewhere past the kitchen. Then nothing. I pulled on my coat and went to the south window without turning on the light. The yard was black, except for a thin wash of moon behind cloud. Rain had stopped. Branches hung still. Scout stood at my knee, ears up, but no sound came out of him. I stayed there long enough for the glass to fog from my breath, then longer, until cold worked through my socks from the floorboards. No second knock came. I put another split in the stove and sat in the chair by the window until the dark thinned to grey. At first light, I walked the south line. Mud held last night's rain in shallow prints from my own boots, nothing else clear enough to read. The trough was empty. On the top rail sat a small pile of cedar bark strips, peeled clean and laid side by side, all facing the same direction. I touched one with a fingertip. Fresh, damp, not windblown. I did not bag them or bring them inside. I left them where they were and stood with my hands in my pockets while Scout sniffed the lower wire and stepped back without crossing his nose through the gap. By noon the clouds thickened again and pushed low over the foothills. I spent the afternoon under the lean-to, sharpening shovel edges and rewrapping one cracked handle with friction tape. Work that kept my hands moving made the waiting easier. Around 3, the wall phone rang. I wiped my palms on my jeans and answered in 2 steps. The ranger from the district office gave his name again before I asked. His voice sounded younger this time, less tired. "Mr. Ford, I wanted to close the loop on your track report." "I appreciate that. We had a team in Randall and checked your notes. With weather degradation and no cast, we cannot classify. Could be bare overprint in thaw and freeze. Could be soil collapse." I looked out the kitchen window at the south line and watched Scout sleeping on the mat. "I measured 16 inches, I said. A short pause came over the line. Paper shifted on his end. "I understand. We are not sending a separate unit for that alone. If you get livestock loss or property damage, call us right away." "I have had neither." "Then monitor and document. That is what we recommend." "All right," I said. "That is what I have been doing." He thanked me for reporting and hung up. I wrote the call time in my notebook, underlined monitor and document, and set the pencil down. By late afternoon, sleet started, light at first, then steady, ticking against the porch rail and turning the yard to grey movement. I mixed feed early and let it sit by the door while I pulled on dry gloves. Scout paced once between stove and threshold, then stopped and waited for me to move first. Outside, the cold sat in the air, like iron. Each breath pinched the back of my throat. I carried the pail to the gap with the hood of my coat half full of sleet pellets. The cedar trough held a thin skin of ice from the hour before. I broke it with my knuckles and poured the mix in one smooth motion. When I gave the whistle, the sound came out lower than usual, swallowed by weather and trees. I stepped back 3 paces and turned my shoulders toward the house, following my mother's rule. Then Scout made a low sound, not warning, more like a tension pulled tight. I looked to the right of the gap beyond the first line of cedar trunks where the ground dropped toward the draw. At first I saw only dark and sleet. Then a shape separated from the trees. High shoulder, broad chest, coat dark and wet along the arms. The head was turned sideways as if one ear was angled toward me and one toward the forest behind it. I froze where I stood. The distance was maybe 40 yards. Enough to hide detail, not enough to mistake size. It was not bare. The arms hung too long and carried weight differently. It was not a man in gear. The torso was too deep through the ribs, and the neck sat low between the shoulders. No sudden movement came from it. No charge, no bluff step. It stood still and watched. Sleet struck my face and melted down my collar. My fingers went numb inside wet gloves. I did not feel the cold for those few breaths. Fear came first as pressure in my chest, then wonder followed it in the same space, so close together I could not pull them apart. I thought of my mother at this fence, year after year, doing one small thing at one fixed hour, trusting routine more than explanation. Scout moved half a step in front of my left boot and then, to my surprise, lay down in the mud. Not cowering, not braced, just down, eyes fixed on the tree line. The figure shifted its weight once. I heard one branch rub against another higher up the slope. Its head tilted, then returned to level. For a moment, sleet thinned, and I caught a clearer line of the face in profile. Heavy brow, broad cheek, no bared teeth, no open mouth. It looked back at me with an attention that felt measured and exact, like we were both being careful with the same fragile thing. I did not raise my hands. I did not speak. I stood and let it read my stillness. Then it withdrew. One step backward into cedar shadow, then another, not hurried, not hesitant. The dark coat blurred with wet trunks and was gone. I listened hard after it vanished. I heard branch sway and one soft thud farther upslope, then only sleet and the creek under ice. I backed toward the porch without turning my back to the trees, reached the boards, and stood under the eave until my breathing evened out. Scout came up beside me, shook water from his coat, and leaned against my shin as if this had been expected. Inside, I stripped wet clothes in the mudroom and set them by the stove. My hands shook when I poured coffee and some spilled on the counter. I drank anyway and went to the notebook while the image was still sharp. I wrote shoulder height above fence top by at least 2 feet. I wrote head turned sideways. I wrote no aggression. Withdrew to timber on own. Then I drew the outline as best I could, rough and plain. That night I did not sleep much, but I did not feel hunted. The house felt occupied by weather and by memory, not by threat. Around 2 a.m, Scout woke once, lifted his head toward the south wall and settled again. 3 evenings passed under the same storm lid, and each dusk I went to the gap at the same hour. On the first of those evenings I changed one thing. I cut a flat alder round from the stack by the shed, set it upright beside the inside fence post, and placed 2 winter pears on top before I filled the trough. A small offering, separate from the regular mix, something visible from the timber. I gave the low whistle and stepped back to my usual place. No movement showed while I stood there. I walked to the porch, stayed on the top step, and waited under the yard light until dark thickened beyond the fence. Scout sat at my boot and watched the same line. We heard one soft step in wet leaves, then another, but no shape broke from the trees. At dawn, both pears were gone. The alder round remained. On top of it lay 3 river stones, stacked from largest to smallest, balanced so cleanly I could have slid a finger between each without dislodging them. I crouched and looked at the stack from all sides. No mud smear from careless placement, no scratch marks from claws, just weight and balance and intent. I left the stones where they were. That afternoon I boiled 6 eggs and peeled 4. I sliced 2 pears and mixed them with grain and fat in the pail. The other 2 eggs I set whole on the alder round before dusk. Scout watched my hands, then looked toward the trees, as if checking for permission from somewhere beyond me. At the fence I whistled once and stepped back. Snow began as fine powder drifting sideways through the cedars. I stayed by the trough longer than usual, then moved to the porch and stood in plain sight, rather than going inside right away. The cold reached through my coat seams. I kept still. After several minutes, a shape appeared again between trunks, farther left than before. Shoulders first, then one long arm braced against a cedar as it leaned to look through the gap. The face stayed half hidden. It did not cross the wire. It did not make sound. I could feel the distance between us like a marked boundary on a map, clear and respected. I lowered my gaze for a second, then brought it back, the way I would with a nervous horse at a gate. No direct challenge, no quick movement. Scout remained seated. His tail tapped the porch once, slow, then stilled. The figure waited. Snow gathered in the fur along its upper arm and did not shake loose. I could hear my own breath and the small hiss of flakes against the porch boards. A minute passed, maybe 2. Time narrowed to the fence, the gap, and that still body in the trees. Then it stepped forward 1 pace, enough for me to see the line of the chest, and both hands. Broad hands, long fingers. One wrist looked thicker than the other under wet fur, but distance made detail uncertain. It angled its head toward the alder round, then toward me, then back to the round. I stayed where I was and said the only words that felt honest. "It is all right." My voice sounded small in the weather. The figure held for another breath, then moved to the side, never turning its back fully, and disappeared behind cedar trunks with a smoothness that did not match its size. Branches quivered after it passed, then settled. I waited until my toes went numb. When no further movement came, I went inside and banked the stove for night. At first light, I walked out with Scout and found the alder round empty of eggs. In their place sat a single antler tine, smooth and pale, laid parallel to the lower fence wire. Beside it rested one clean feather, dark at the tip, dry despite fresh snow around it. I picked up neither. I stood with Scout at my knee and let the morning settle in around us. Behind the south line, cedars held their snow and the draw carried water under ice. The ranch was still mine to keep, fence by fence and chaw by chaw. But at that gap, at that hour, it was no longer only mine. I stood there another minute, hat in my hand, while Scout leaned his shoulder against my leg and watched the cedars with me. Snow kept falling in thin, dry lines. The antler tine and feather sat where they had been placed, clean against white crust, as deliberate as any note left on a table. I did not pick them up. I let them remain at the rail, and I went back to the house to start the stove and set water on. By the third day after the feather appeared, the weather shifted from early winter to something harder. Cold came up through the ground instead of down from the sky. The creek behind the south draw skinned over at the edges, then ran black and narrow in the middle. Men in town called that pattern blueback winter when I was a kid. My mother used the same name and said it like a warning, not a complaint. I checked fuel, stacked dry fur in the mudroom, and moved the chain hoist from the barn to the truck bed in case I needed it for a stuck axle or a downed post line. The routine held even with the cold biting deeper each night. Feed at dusk. One low whistle. Step back from the gap. Scout came every time, slower now in his old joints, but steady. Twice I saw movement high in the cedar trunks and nothing more than a shoulder line before dark took it. Once I found a stack of 4 stones on the alder round. Once I found nothing at all. Just empty boards and snow blown smooth. On the 5th evening, the wind began before sunset and did not ease. It came from the east in long bursts that made the barn tin groan and sent fir needles across the yard like rain. I carried the pail under one arm and kept the other over my face. Scout stayed tight at my heel. I poured feed into the trough by feel more than sight, gave the whistle, and backed away with my boots sliding in new powder over old ice. Halfway to the porch, I heard one deep call from down in the draw. It was not coyote and not elk. It was low, blunt, and cut short at the end like breath had failed under weight. I stopped where I was. Scout froze too, head high, ears forward, body pointed downslope towards the creek line. The call came again, weaker, then a heavy thrash that snapped brush below the fence. I went back inside for my coat shell and flashlight. I took the rifle from the rack by habit and slung it over my shoulder, then stood at the door with my hand on the latch and listened. The wind dropped for a moment, and from the draw came the sound of ice breaking in fast, hard cracks, followed by water moving around something large that could not get leverage. Scout looked at me, then at the back gate. "All right," I said, "we go." The path to the draw was steep and half hidden under drift. I kept one hand on alder trunks and one on the flashlight, stepping where roots crossed the slope. The beam caught white bark, wet stone and blowing snow. 50 yards down, the creek bent through a narrow cut where summer water stayed ankle deep and winter ice made a shelf. That shelf had collapsed near the outside bank. Black water churned in the opening. The creature was there, half in and half out, angled under a lip of ice and packed snow. One arm was braced on the bank. The other was down in the water, held at an unnatural line by something below the surface. It tried to pull free once and slid deeper at the hips. breath came in harsh bursts. Wet fur along the chest and shoulders had iced over in ridges. I took 2 steps closer and the rifle strap bit into my shoulder. The creature turned its head toward me. Snow and water ran off its brow. Its mouth opened once, not in threat, just effort, and it drove its free hand into the mud for purchase that did not hold. I saw wire then, rusted trap cable, probably old logging snare or abandoned salvage line, wrapped around submerged root and cinched tight over its wrist each time current pulled. I stood there with the wind cutting through my gloves and felt the choice come clear and simple. If I left it, the creek would finish what the wire started. If I went in, I could lose footing and join it under the ice, and no one would know until spring runoff. I thought of my mother's instruction. Same place, same hour, same whistle, and what that discipline had asked of her for 7 winters. No claiming, no chasing, just showing up. I unslung the rifle and laid it in the snow above the bank. I set the flashlight beside it and ran for the truck. The chain and come-along were in the bed under a tarp crusted with ice. My fingers fumbled the knots once, then got them loose. I grabbed 2 tow straps, bolt cutters, and the old canvas drag sheet I used for feed sacks. Scout ran ahead of me back to the slope, stopping at the lip and looking down until I reached him. The creature had sunk lower. Water was up to its ribs now. I slid down the bank on my boots and went to one knee in slush. Its free arm lifted halfway, then dropped. I spoke without thinking, voice low and even the way I used with spooked stock. "Hold still. I am working." I looped a tow strap under its upper chest from the bankside first, keeping distance from its head and free hand. It did not lunge. It did not strike. It watched and breathed, each exhale rough and white. I fed the strap back through itself and cinched it high where it would not tighten around the throat. Then I climbed out, anchored one end of the come-along to a cedar trunk uphill, and clipped the other to the strap ring. When I ratcheted, metal clicked loud in the wind. The strap tightened. The creature came forward inches, then stopped hard. The trapped arm held fast below the ice. I could hear cable grind against root with each pull. I left tension on the line and crawled to the edge again, lying flat to reach into black water with the bolt cutters. The cold hit like fire up to my elbow. I could not see the cable lock, only feel twisted strands under mud and ice. Twice the cutters slipped. The third bite caught and took one outer strand. I worked at it again, hand numb, jaw clenched, while current shoved my sleeve against the cut edge. The creature gave a short groan and braced its free hand against the bank. I got one more bite and felt the cable relax a fraction. I pulled at the loosened loop with both hands, and it shifted off bone enough for me to slide it down toward the hand. "Now," I said, though I did not know whether it understood words or only tone. I cranked the come-along as fast as my shaking arms allowed. Click, pull, click, pull. The strap dug in and lifted chest and shoulders clear. The trapped arm came free with a sudden release that rolled both of us sideways in slush. The creature hit the bank and lay there, coughing water and ice, while I reset my feet and kept tension until its hips cleared the hole. We stayed like that several breaths, both shaking, wind flattening snow across us. Then I swapped the strap to the canvas drag sheet, rolled one edge under its side and used the come-along to help inch it uphill. Scout circled wide, silent, eyes fixed and alert. The climb from creek to yard took longer than I can measure cleanly. I hauled, reset, hauled again, boots slipping, shoulders burning. Twice I had to stop and clear frozen brush from the path. Once the creature tried to push up and failed, then held still when I laid a hand on the sheet and said, "Not yet." I did not take it into the house. The doorways were narrow, and the line between shelter and possession mattered to me in a way I could not explain aloud. I dragged it to the tool shed instead, the one with the cast stove and wide sliding door. I kicked the door open, pulled the sheet over the threshold, and got it inside onto old horse blankets stacked near the wall. The shed smelled of oil, dry wood, and cold iron. I shoved kindling into the stove, lit it with a strip of newspaper, and fed split fur until heat began to push back the damp. Scout settled by the doorway, not blocking it, watching both of us. Only then did I kneel by the injured arm and look close. The wrist had a deep cable groove around it, swollen and packed with mud, fur matted tight to skin. There were shallow cuts on the forearm from ice edge and one longer scrape over the shoulder where it had hit rock. None looked mortal, but cold could kill as cleanly as any wound. I filled a bucket with warmed water from the kettle, cut strips from clean shop cloth, and set my mother's salve tin by my knee, pine resin and tallow. She made for cracked hands and torn hide. When I touched the wrist, the creature tensed, chest lifting. I kept my hand there, steady pressure, and waited. Its breathing slowed by degrees. I rinsed mud from the groove with warm water, dark runoff pooling on the shed floor. I trimmed away clumped fur with shears so I could see where skin split and where it only bruised. Blood came in thin lines, then stopped under pressure and clean wraps. I worked in silence except for stovepop and wind on the shed roof. Rinse, check, pack cloth, wrap, tie. I rubbed salve into the cut edges where cable had burned through outer skin. I bound the shoulder scrape with a broad strip and left room for movement. I set a second blanket over its back, when shivering returned and fed more wood to the stove. At some point near midnight, when the worst of the wind shifted north, I brought in the cedar trough from the fence and set it near the door, as a familiar object, more than a feed pan. I filled a shallow basin with warm water and slid it within reach. The creature watched every motion. Its eyes tracked my hands, then the doorway, then my face, then back to my hands. Not tame, not panicked, present. I sat on an overturned bucket across from it, with Scout against my boot, and waited through the long, cold hours while heat built and held. Twice I changed the wrist wrap where seepage dampened through. Once I added a wedge under the forearm to keep strain off the groove. Each time I moved close, it stiffened and then settled when I stayed predictable. Just before dawn, the rafters stopped creaking and the storm eased to a soft hiss of snow against the shed wall. The creature lay angled toward the open path to the door, wrapped arm across its chest, breathing deep and even at last. I placed one more split on the stove, checked the knot on the bandage, and sat back down in the dim orange light, with Scout quiet at my side and the first grey of morning beginning to show under the door. I sat back down in the dim orange light, with Scout quiet at my side, and the first grey of morning beginning to show under the door. The creature opened its eyes before full light reached the shed. It did not startle awake. It came up slowly from sleep, breath deepening, shoulders tightening once, then easing when it found the door still open and the path out clear. I kept my hands on my knees where it could see them. The stove ticked as iron warmed and cooled in small shifts. Meltwater dripped from the hem of my coat onto packed dirt. The wrapped wrist rested against its chest, and I watched it test the bandage with 2 fingers of the other hand, careful, almost curious. "It is clean," I said. "Do not pull it yet." My voice sounded rough from cold and no sleep. It watched my mouth, then my eyes, then the bucket of water by my boot. There was strain in its face, but no panic. Its eyes were dark and steady. Not wild, not angry, just alert in a way that felt close to how Scout watched me when we worked gates in bad weather. For a long minute, neither of us moved. Outside, wind had gone quiet enough that I could hear water running again in the drawer, freed by a little dawn thaw under the ice. Scout lifted his head and gave one slow tail tap on the floorboards, then set his chin back down. The creature shifted weight and sat up straighter against the wall. It was larger than it had looked in the storm, even folded in on itself, chest broad and heavy through the ribs. The wet fur along its shoulders had dried in rough ridges near the stove heat. Mud still marked one hip where I had dragged it over the bank, and the smell of creek water and cedar smoke hung in the shed around all three of us. I took the kettle from the stove and poured warm water into a tin pan. Then I nudged it toward the horse blanket with my boot and leaned back again. It tracked the pan, then me. After a pause, it reached with the uninjured hand and pulled the pan close, not breaking eye contact until its fingers touched metal. That was the moment something settled between us. I had spent my whole adult life measuring things I could fix: wire lengths, feed weight, fuel levels, fence sag. Grief had never fit that system. It sat in me like a task with no tools. In that shed, with daylight rising and Scout breathing steady at my leg, I understood one plain thing my mother had known before me. Care could cross a boundary without erasing it. Help did not have to become ownership. The creature dipped its fingers into the warm water and held them there. Steam lifted around its hand. It flexed the wrapped wrist once and winced, teeth showing for a second. Then the jaw eased. I pointed toward the bandage. "Leave it until night," I said. It did not answer in any human way. It drank from the pan in short pulls, then set it down upright without spilling. After that, it looked toward the cedar trough near the door. I had brought it in after midnight out of habit, and maybe out of hope. The trough sat on its side where I had leaned it against the wall, feed stains dark in the grain from years of weather. The creature placed its broad, good hand flat on that trough and kept it there. Then it turned back to me. We held each other's gaze for a full count of breaths, longer than any stare between strangers should last. Yet it did not feel like challenge. It felt like acknowledgement. It was as if we were naming terms without words. You came when called. You did not take more than needed. You kept the line. Scout stood and moved 2 steps closer, not between us, just near enough that his flank brushed my knee. He sniffed once toward the creature, then sat again. No growl, no stiff hackles, just watchfulness and calm. By the time a pale stripe of sun touched the shed threshold, the creature gathered itself to stand. It went slowly, bracing with the good arm, protecting the wrapped wrist against its chest. When it was upright, its head nearly reached the lowest crossbeam. It swayed once, caught balance, and waited. I stepped aside from the doorway to give it clear room. "Go on," I said. It moved past me with careful steps, close enough that I heard the scrape of dry fur against the doorframe. At the threshold, it paused and turned its head toward the house, then toward the south fence line beyond the yard. For an instant, it held still as if listening for something just beyond hearing. Then it went down the path to the gap without looking back. Scout and I followed at a distance. Snow in the yard had crusted overnight. My boots broke through with each step. The creature left deep prints, one line from shed to fence, steady but favoring the injured side. At the gap, it stopped once more. The lower wire pin still sat in place from the night before. It bent, slipped through without touching the strands, and straightened on the timber side. It looked at me over the rail one last time. Then it lifted the uninjured hand, palm open. Not high, just enough to be clear. A gesture I had seen people use at roadsides and field edges all my life. Not a wave, a simple leave-taking. I nodded because anything more would have been too much. It turned and disappeared into cedar and fir, moving with that same quiet economy that had unsettled me the first night I heard Branch wait in the dark. Scout stood at the gap long after the last branch settled. I checked the prints once, then went back to the shed and cleaned what needed cleaning. I burned the bloodied cloth in the stove, scrubbed the pan, boiled fresh water, and hung the drag sheet to dry. I coiled the chain and come along and set them by the truck tailgate. On a nail above the workbench, I hung the bolt cutters with a tag from masking tape. Used at South Draw, Blueback Storm. I did not know why I labelled it, except that some acts deserve to be remembered plain. By the second day after the storm, Blueback winter broke in a hard thaw. Water came down the upper draw faster than expected, loud enough by noon that I could hear rocks knocking under current from the porch. In past years, that flow had jumped the south bank and cut a channel through my lower pasture, taking fence posts with it. I pulled on waders, took a shovel, and went to the south line ready for damage. I found none where it should have been worst. Above the fence gap, someone had opened a new drainage lane through alder roots and stone, just wide enough to turn a floodwater back toward the old creek bed. 3 flat rocks had been livered from the bank and set as a spill step. 2 dead limbs, both too heavy for one man to carry easy in mud, were wedged crosswise to brace the cut. Water ran through that improvised channel in a clean rush and missed my fence by 10 feet. I stood in sleet and looked at that work for a long time. Tool marks were absent. No shovel slices, no boot tread, just hand-moved weight, deliberate and practical. Labour answering labour. That evening, as promised to no one but the habit itself, I mixed feed and carried it to the trough at dusk. Scout came beside me, limping a little in the cold, stubborn as ever. I gave the same low whistle and stepped back from the gap. We waited, then went inside. At dawn, the trough was empty. On the top rail sat a braid of cedar bark, 3 strips woven tight and looped once around a smooth grey stone. I remembered the first stone from October, the one I had lifted and replaced. This one was larger and darker, river-polished, wet with morning fog. I left it on the rail all day. 3 days passed before I saw any shape at the tree line. By then, the wrist bandage scraps I had buried in ash were gone to weather, and the creek had dropped to winter normal. At dusk, just after my whistle, Scout raised his head toward the south timber and gave one low huff through his nose. I followed his gaze. They stood beyond the first cedar line, half-shadowed in blue light. Not one shape. 3. The injured one was nearest, wrapped wrist held close but weight more even now. 10 yards behind stood a larger figure, broader through the shoulders, and to its left, a smaller one, narrow and still. None crossed the wire. None made a sound. They watched the trough, then me, then Scout. I felt my pulse in my throat, but no fear in it. I did not step forward. I did not call out. I kept my hands low and open at my sides and stayed where my mother had always stood, 2 paces back from the gap. After a long quiet, the larger figure bent and set something at the base of a cedar stump just outside the fence. Then all 3 withdrew at once, not hurried, slipping between trunks until only dark and branch remained. I waited until full dark before crossing the yard light edge and going to the stump. There, I found 3 sticks, each stripped clean and cut square at the ends, crossed together in a careful lattice. 1 long, 1 medium, 1 short. I carried them to the porch and laid them on the bench beside the door. Scout climbed up, circled once, and rested his head on my boot while I sat with the sticks and listened to creek water running, where it should run now. By the first week of December, I had set a small shelf in the mudroom above my mother's fence tools. On it sat the first grey stone, the dried apple stem, the antler tine, the dark feather, and the woven cedar loop with its river rock. I did not call them proof. I did not call them signs. They were part of the record, same as dates and measurements in the notebook. Things exchanged, things kept. That night at dusk I took the pail to the gap, poured feed into the cedar trough, and gave one low whistle into the cold. Scout stood steady at my side, ears forward, breath white in the fading light. The ranch stayed solitary, fence by fence and field by field, but the silence around it no longer felt vacant. It felt inhabited by memory, by work, answered, and by a voice carried forward the only way that mattered. I stood at the gap until my fingers went stiff, then carried the empty pail back to the mudroom and set it upside down to dry. Scout drank, circled once by the stove, and lowered himself with a slow grunt that came with cold nights now. I took the notebook from the kitchen table and added one line under that evening's entry. 3 seen at Cedar Line. Gift left at stump. No approach past wire. Then I opened my mother's cedar box and laid the 3-stick lattice inside on top of her pliers and fence hammer. Not hidden, just kept where useful things belonged. Before sleep, I stepped onto the porch again. The yard light showed fresh snow and our 2 tracks to the fence and back. And at the rail, the cedar trough was still dark with feed stain and frost. Beyond it, only trunks and shadow. I gave no whistle at night. I had learned that rhythm mattered more than curiosity. Inside, I banked the stove and listened to Scout breathing from the rug by the door until I slept. 2 mornings later, while I was splitting alder by the barn, a Green District truck came up the road and stopped by the cattle guard. The same ranger from the phone call stepped out, collar up against sleet, clipboard under one arm. He introduced himself again, shook my hand once, and glanced toward the south line before he spoke. "I was in the valley for a fence complaint," he said. "I figured I should close your report in person." I nodded and leaned the maul against the block. "I appreciate that." We walked to the south gap with Scout trailing us. The ranger crouched by the rail, looked at the trough, looked at the drainage cut above the fence, and took 2 photos with his work phone. He measured one old print still pressed hard near the shed path where Thor had spared it, then stood and wrote for a while with his back to the wind. "Could be a lot of things," he said at last. "Large bear, substrate distortion, freeze thaw." I handed him an envelope with the track photos I had taken in October and 1 copy of my page measurements. "That is what I have." He looked at the envelope, but did not open it there. "We will log it." He gave Scout a short look, the kind men give old dogs they respect, then looked back at me. There was a pause where he might have asked what he thought I believed. He did not. He only said, "If there is livestock loss, call right away." "I have had none," I said. He nodded once and headed back to his truck. He never came again. In late January, a state envelope arrived with a stamped form that read, "No actionable determination. Documentation retained." I folded the letter and put it in the notebook pocket with the date and time of his visit. That was the last form I filed and the last office call I made. That evening, I wrote 1 more line beneath the case number. No more classification sought. The relationship at the fence is enough. I closed the question of what to call them and kept the boundary instead. That afternoon, I took every item from the mudroom shelf and set them in order on the metal table by the window. First grey stone, dried apple stem, antler tine, dark feather, woven cedar loop, and river rock. I cleaned each with a dry cloth only, no oil, no water, no scraping. They were not trophies. They were records of exchanges made at a fence line where both sides had kept terms. I wrote 1 card for each in block letters, dated to the day found, and I added a final note under all 5 cards. Not submitted, retained on site by choice. Then I put them back on the shelf above the fence tools where morning light hit them first. I kept the routine through that winter and the next. Same place, same hour, same whistle. Some nights the feed stayed untouched until dawn, and I found it gone at first light. Some nights I heard steps pacing me from the timber as I walked back to the porch. On 3 evenings I saw a shoulder line between cedars, and once the broad shape of a hand, lifted at rail height and lowered again. The woodknocks from early October never returned after the storm rescue. The branch bend pacing sound did, but only on windless nights. The apple stems never appeared again. The stone stacks did, always 3 stones, always balanced with care. By the 2nd week of March, in my 2nd year back, I carried the antler tine and the feather from the shelf to the alder round and left them there before dusk feed. I did not feel right keeping all of it under my roof. At dawn both were gone. In their place sat 2 peeled cedar strips laid parallel. No crossing this time. Simple and clear. I logged that return in the notebook and did not bring the strips inside. By sunset, rain had flattened them to the dirt, and I let weather take what weather wanted. Scout grew slower each season but never missed dusk at the South Gap while his legs held him. In his last autumn he did not walk the full distance. He waited on the porch while I carried feed down and whistled. One evening, after the first hard frost silvered the yard, I came back to find him standing on unsteady legs, facing the south fence with both ears up. I sat beside him on the top step until dark and rested my hand on his neck. He died in his sleep before dawn 2 weeks later, curled by the back door where he had listened for years. I buried him under the old serviceberry above the shed and set 1 flat creek stone at the head, plain and uncarved. That first dusk without him, I almost missed the hour because the house sounded wrong without his nails on the floorboards. I took the pail anyway. At the gap, I gave the low whistle and waited longer than usual, hat in my hands, cold pressing through my coat seams. Just as I turned to go, 1 low chest call came from the cedar line. The same blunt sound I'd heard in Blueback Winter, but steady this time, not distressed. It did not come closer. It did not repeat. I stood until my breath fogged thick and then went back to the porch with my throat tight and my hands steady. Seasons worked through the ranch in their fixed order. Fence staples loosened and were reset. Pasture grass browned and came back. Snow loaded the roof and slid in wet sheets by noon thaw. The mudroom shelf stayed unchanged except for dusting, and dates added in the notebook. I never spoke of the South Gap in town. No one pressed me. Over the years, people at the feed counter saw what I bought and let silence stand, and that suited me. On the 7th anniversary of my mother's death, I finished chores early and walked to the cemetery in Packwood before noon. I brought no flowers, only a thermos of coffee and the small hand whisk she used to keep in her apron pocket for mixing feed fat into grain. I sat by her stone, poured 1 cup and set the whisk at the base where rain could take it or not. I told her the south line still held. I told her the whistle had not changed. Then I drove home in quiet, reached the ranch by late afternoon, and split kindling until the sun dropped behind the ridge. At dusk I mixed feed by weight from memory without opening the red notebook. Pear, grain, salt, half egg. I carried the pail to the South Gap and poured it into the cedar trough. The cold had that dry edge it gets before full dark in December, and my breath rose white, then vanished. I gave 1 low whistle, same as always, and stepped back 2 paces from the wire. Nothing moved while light remained on the top branches. I stood and listened to creek water under thin ice and the small tick of cooling metal on the fence brace. When shadow filled the draw, I turned toward the house. Then I saw them on the rail, 3 sticks stripped clean and cut square, one long, one medium, one short, crossed with exact symmetry over the gap. I did not touch them. I sat down on the frozen ground beside the post and leaned my back against weathered cedar. The ranch spread around me in dark fields and timber edges. No house lights but mine, no other voices, no dog at my knee. From beyond the fence came one soft step, then stillness. I stayed there until the last light thinned out of the trees, looking at those 3 crossed sticks on the rail. And for the first time since my mother died, solitude felt like a place already shared.